small scene what they were trying to do for the whole movie. So it would have been a much darker film. There was a sailboat regatta scene place in the script, but it wasn't anything like you saw with these kids. They took that element and they made it 10 times bigger. It was just a regatta, like a race. And the shark, wreaks a little bit of havoc. There was no helicopter that gets torn up and eaten by a shark. Instead, there's a scene where not too far from Martha's Vineyard is the coast of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And today there's still a big Navy base in New London. And that helicopter scene was actually a scene where a Navy helicopter is putting down sonar buoys and tracking them. And the shark, bites it, grabs it, whatever, gives the helicopter a good tug, scares the hell out of the crew or whatnot, but they figure they just got something tangled. But in reality, it was the shark, and so it was just that was kind of it. But if you really want to know what Jaws 2 could have been, read the novel, because the novel was put out and is 100% based on Sackler and Dorothy Tristan's script, and I think Tristan actually wrote the novel. And you'll see for yourselves, it's much different than what they did for Jaws 2. So when they decided that they wanted to make it a little bit more brighter and make it more action-filled and a lot less dramatic, I'd say it went from drama to almost bubblegum. Carl Gottlieb, who wrote a lot of the Jaws script as they were making the film, was hired to come in and rewrite the script completely. So they stopped production, hired Jean Schwark.
I say Jean Schwark.
Zwark. They brought him in, obviously, to make the movie, and Gottlieb just it's kind of coincidental. Grease was out pretty much at the same time. Kids cruising and all this other stuff. He put this thing together, which is, to be quite honest with you, growing up on the ocean and all that stuff, the idea of a bunch of teenagers on sailboats cruising around is pretty far-fetched.
Interesting. Okay, I was going to ask you about that because I did not grow up on the water. I was curious if you had any insight.
Yeah, I mean, there's people that do sailboating as a hobby and stuff, and you'll see them, in Newport Harbor and all this, but not in the type of sailboats that these guys had. Not that people don't do that, they do, but, like groups of teenagers cruising in sailboats, that was a little bit out there, but that's what Gottlieb came up with, and then everything kind of centered around them, and it changed the movie completely from what it was originally. And maybe when you read the novel and you see what came out, I don't know if the first version would have worked any better, but it would have been a very, very different film.
Well, let me ask you this, Ken: how much of the original Hancock version did they complete? Like, are we talking like 30%, 50%? When did they shut down and restart?
Very, very little. He was doing most of his work on Martha's Vineyard at the time, setting things up. He didn't get along too well with the producers. He really had a vision. He really did. Kind of like a Tim Burton type thing. He really wanted this thing dark. There isn't enough to know if his impression was to show a lot of shark. Now, that was Schwark's thing. The more shark you can get, the better. We want to show the shark. There isn't really a feel as to whether John Hancock wanted to go in that direction. He doesn't really talk about it. His wife talks about it. There's a book out there by Louis Pisano and Michael Smith called Jaws 2: The Making of the Hollywood Sequel. Not a well-known book, by the way, but a fascinating. I love whether they're great movies, bad movies. I love understanding how movies were made, especially ones as technically as challenging as a Jaws film is. And this captures a lot of that detail. And actually reading that book is what got me to read the novel again, because I think I read it when I was a kid, but it didn't stick. And I went, whoa, this would have been pretty good, like the water skiing scene, that stuff was in there, and things like that. But that was not filmed by Hancock at all. Hancock didn't film any of the shark scenes, I think, other than that one scene where the shark is floating through the harbor. That's it.
And just to be clear, you mentioned the novelization. It's a novelization of the original script. It's not Peter Benchley did not write a sequel novel to Jaws in the same way that Michael Crichton wrote a sequel novel to Jurassic Park, which Steven Spielberg then made a sequel to. It's a very different situation.
Yes, Benchley went on to write another book called The Deep, which was made into another movie with Robert Shaw, Jacqueline Bisset, that took place off Bermuda, which dealt with a shipwreck that was full of morphine and had some gangsters in it. Louis Gossett Jr. was in that movie. And he's done a few. He did a lot more than novels than that, and then he started to write more scientific books, things along those lines. But yeah, I think The Deep was his follow-on novel, but no sequel to Jaws.
Just since you mentioned it, I just want to mention the cover to The Island, the book. I had the book, and I don't think I ever got around to reading it, but it's like this low point of view from the water towards an island, and there's like a hand coming up with one of those like Rambo hunting knives, and there's like a skull and crossbones on its arm, and that's all that you see. It's a great cover to a book.
I don't know if The Island was Peter Benchley's. Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because I remember The Deep. That's what I remember.
Or The Deep. Sorry, The Deep. Yes. Yeah. So first thing I got to say is I'm actually flabbergasted that there's a guy named John Hancock, because isn't that what you say when you want to get somebody to write their name on something? You put your John Hancock on this?
Yes. He was a founding father of the Declaration of Independence, and when he signed it really big. And that's why everyone calls it your signature of John Hancock. American Brandon.
See, I don't know anything about that. There you go.
He has his is the most prominent signature on the Declaration. That's right. Another Boston guy. Mm-hmm.
Well, what do I know about American Declarations of Independence? Not very much. That's what.
There it is.
Okay, so I like this movie, and I like this movie a lot. I think this movie is a lot of fun, and I know that this movie has a really bad rap out there, and I want to read something from a friend of ours. So a friend, Kessel Junkie online, has written a review for Jaws 2 on Letterboxd, and I just want to read one of the lines that he has in this review. He says, Jaws 2 completely misunderstands what made Jaws so special, and instead attempts to construct a horror movie with a thin plot, cheap characters, and questionable premise. It's not about the characters this time, it's about the scares and the blood. And to me, while yes, that is exactly true, it does not do what the first movie did. I don't think that it misunderstands what the first movie did. I think that it's just you can't simply remake the first movie in a sequel, so it's taking it off in a completely different direction. Like, when you're watching this movie, like, it's ridiculous that this shark is eating this many people. It could not fit this much food in its body. Like, I don't know what our death count is when we get to it. We'll talk about it, but it's like 15 or 20 people. And this movie takes place in a short amount of time, okay? Like, this is a very condensed film. Like, so it is kind of ridiculous. Now, this is prior to, our slasher movies like Friday the 13th. It came out the same year as Halloween, right? But it's kind of prior to that slasher genre. But this is almost like a slasher movie sequel, right? Where the death count is amped, and you've got this unrelenting force that's simply going around and killing people. And that's what I like about the movie. So, like, I don't know. I guess I don't understand why people don't like this movie. It's not Jaws, right? And I'm not going to sit here like I did with The Godfather 3 and say The Godfather 3, I think, is a 5-star film. It's not as good as the first, but it's still a masterpiece. This is no masterpiece by any means, but I think it's a really fun film, and I really enjoy watching this movie a lot. So I kind of wanted to start with that, and then I'll pass it off to you, Ken. What do you think about what I just said and your opinions on the film itself?
Well, to put it in context, Brandon, Jaws being what it was, and no movie before it quite like it, and certainly tackling something that obviously was very difficult to do, I think that a lot of us, when we went to see Jaws 2, were ready to suspend disbelief to a certain degree. I just don't think we were prepared to have to suspend it as far as we did. And a lot of the filming that they did in Jaws 2 was just so different, right? There was no beach deaths. There was, it was kind of like, you had everybody so reluctant to believe there was a shark there, and they kind of pull you along, and it's, the deaths are spectacular. I mean, it's catching a water skier. That ain't easy. It's taking out a boat. It's just doing a lot of things. It's eating two divers right at the beginning of the film. I mean, it really is just, like you said, it's just so different. That I think a lot of people like me, when you go from such an incredible movie And I was yearning to be scared. I was yearning to have that same tension. And you're right. It's not a tension film flick. It's not really that scary a movie. It's a slasher film. And to make that transition, I think, was difficult for a lot of us. I think that you probably have the better view of it because you're very removed from it. You probably saw it many years after it was actually made. And it just has a completely different feel. It's one of those movies that if that was the original Jaws, how would that have played? I think is a fair question to ask. All right, and it wouldn't be as bad as what you're seeing on the Sci-Fi Channel, and it might have scared some people, but they went to the extreme. I mean, they actually defaced the shark, right? They give it a burnt face, because of the fire on the boat, and it's not only just a big bad shark; it's a big disfigured shark, and it was almost like, wow, how different do you want to make it? And that's why I think, if you read Jaws 2, the novel, and I'll ask you, if you can at some time to actually do it, I'd be interested in your thoughts then. So you see what they were going to make, which I think would have been a little bit more believable because the scaling was similar to Jaws in terms of the deaths and how they die. And what's happened to the island and all that stuff was fairly plausible. But I don't know. It's a tough one. But I do hear what you're saying. If you can make the transition in your mind that it's just its own film, it's teenagers in peril. I guess I didn't even think of it that way, but it is the Friday the 13th on the water before any of it was. It's the teenagers in jeopardy. That certainly was not Jaws, but it became a very popular genre after Jaws 2, the teenagers in peril type thing. So fascinating view that I've never thought of before. So
and that might be why I like it, is because I do like those slasher films so much.
Yeah.
You mentioned read the book sometime and then see what you think then. Like, I understand what you're saying, and I think that's really interesting, and I'll probably do that at some point, but I don't like to get caught up in that trap. Like, we have so many movies that are like, oh, if only they could have done what they wanted to do. Like, look at Star Trek V. How many times have we talked about Star Trek V? Like, William Shatner wanted to do this, and he wanted to do this. And, well, that's not what we got, though. We have what we have, and there's so many movies that ended up not being what they wanted them to be for budget, time, like so many different things, right? Like even the Star Trek the Motion Picture wasn't really what they wanted it to be because they couldn't get the effects done properly in time, right? Stuff like that. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of love that it is what it is. And you mentioned earlier a couple of minutes ago how it's not very believable that teenagers would be riding these boats around. But like, until you said that, like, to me, that's a very believable thing that kids would do in this day and age. And while we're watching this movie, I turned to Aubrey. I'm like, these kids are just going out. This is what they would do on an island. They don't have iPads in 1978. So kids go out cruising, and instead of cruising on cars, they're on an island. So they're going to go cruising on boats. And so to me, as a person who doesn't know anything about living on an island, that's a very believable thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I thought that was a very interesting aspect to the film.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the third best shark movie of all time. Jaws, Deep Blue Sea, and then Jaws 2. Because most shark movies are just awful. Like, most shark movies are just terrible ripoffs of the original Jaws. So, yeah, Jaws 2 is like, it's not even half the movie the original one is, but as a self-contained thing, I guess it's fine. I guess my biggest problem with it is the time and attention that it spends on these forgettable teenage characters who I don't even know half of their names. I don't know which one's dating who. They're all very similar looking. Like, it just seems like they added more people in order to kill off more people, and that was the only reason they had all these characters. I feel like if they could have just focused down onto just 2 or 3 of these characters, maybe, Brody and his son, a love interest, and maybe a couple other friends, and that's it, instead of the 15 kids or whatever we got. And it's like the difference between Jurassic Park and the Lost World Jurassic Park, and I use that comparison because it's 2 Spielberg movies. Jurassic Park, you have about 6 or 7 key characters on this island, and you have some dinosaurs, and you're following these characters, and they're all very memorable, interesting characters who play off each other dynamic.